Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello, this is Sonia Torse. I'm here with Truth in My Days director John Torse for a discussion about another important topic. John, there's a challenge against Christianity that comes up not infrequently these days, and that's the claim that the Bible's immoral because it endorses slavery. I want you to listen to this clip from Sam Harris. Harris is a philosopher with a doctorate in neuroscience and an outspoken atheist, one of the so-called four horsemen of the new atheism. In this clip, he makes this challenge against Christianity.
This is the start of the recording from the YouTube video.
The Bible, in my view, can't be the real repository of our moral wisdom in any sense, because when you go to read it, you are forced to ignore certain passages or reinterpret them rather aggressively to conform to what you now in the 21st century have every reason to believe is good or a direction worth going. It is just an inconvenient fact that slavery is endorsed in the Bible, explicitly endorsed in the Old Testament, and it's certainly not repudiated in the New. Jesus told slaves to serve their masters and to serve their Christian masters especially well. There's no place in the Bible where you can get a truly compelling case against slavery.
This is the end of the recording from the YouTube video.
Okay, then let's sum up Harris's points in this argument. He says that the Bible is not a repository of moral wisdom because parts would have to be ignored or reinterpreted to conform to what we now in the 21st century have every reason to believe is good or a direction worth going socially. Then he says slavery is endorsed in the Bible, explicitly in the Old Testament, and not repudiated in the New Testament. He says that Jesus told slaves to serve their masters and to serve their Christian masters especially well. I think he's confusing Jesus' words with some of the epistles, with things that some of the epistles say, because Jesus didn't actually say this. And then he says there's no place in the Bible where you can get a truly compelling case against slavery.
Okay, on what grounds does he say that the Bible endorses slavery?
Well, in the Old Testament law, the Mosaic law, slavery is addressed in a few passages, notably Leviticus 25, which includes provisions on acquiring slaves and how to treat them. They're not to be Israelites. Israelites were indentured servants. They would receive money for their servitude, and it was not permanent. At the year of Jubilee, they were to be released. We also read things like in Deuteronomy 23:15, "You shall not give back to his master the slave who has escaped from his master to you." So there are some passages in the Old Testament governing or regulating slavery.
Okay, but we're not under Old Testament law anymore, so what about the New Testament?
In the New Testament, Harris is objecting to passages like Ephesians 6, 5-7, which starts this way, bondservants. Now, bondservant, the word means slave, but perhaps it doesn't have the same negative connotation, maybe because people don't immediately understand what it means. This term wasn't invented until the 15th century. And I'm wondering if they invented it then to try to make it sound a little bit better, but certainly the Greek word is slaves. So Ephesians 6, 5-7 starts this way, "Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart." Colossians 3, 22-25 starts this way, "Slaves, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God." We have 1 Timothy 6, 1-2, which says, "Let as many slaves as under the yoke count their own masters worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and his doctrine may not be blasphemed. And those who have believing masters, let them not despise them because they are brethren, but rather serve them because those who are benefited are believers and beloved." Titus 2, 9-10 starts with, "Exhort bond servants to be obedient to their own masters, to be well-pleasing in all things, not answering back, not pilfering, but showing all good fidelity, that they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior in all things. 1 Peter 2:18 says, servants, and here the term used is for household servants, domestics, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. So these are the passages that Harris objects to, and he's certainly not the only one. As I said, this is not at all a rare challenge against Christianity. There's a YouTuber who calls himself Non-Alchemist, and under Evidence Against the Bible, he says that the Lord is depicted as granting the Israelites legal permission to buy slaves from the nations around them, to become their property as slaves for life, and they could be passed down to their children as inherited property. When presented with examples of immoral biblical passages, Christians have a few options. One is to just take the passage at face value and double down on its moral acceptability. I trust that anyone with a modicum of moral sense can see why that's highly problematic. Consider instead the hypothesis that the Bible is a merely human collection of texts. It's much more expected that we're going to find moral errors, even very obvious ones, on the second hypothesis. The kind of flawed morality we see in certain places is exactly what we would expect. All too human moral mistakes peppered throughout.
Well, then, so does the Bible endorse slavery after all? I mean, even if our own translators had to change slaves to bondservants, does that suggest Sam Harris actually has a point?
I'd say no and no. No, the Bible does not endorse slavery, and no, Sam Harris doesn't have a point, though I would say the translators didn't need to change it. I don't know why they did.
Okay, so how would you answer Sam Harris and The Alchemist?
Well, how do Christian apologists answer them? Generally, they will say that, well, the slavery in the Old Testament was not so bad. It wasn't like the slavery in the Roman Empire. It certainly wasn't like the slavery in the United States and the American South, particularly before the Civil War. They will say that it was actually really just indentured servitude. The people got money for selling themselves, and it was temporary. They were not held in bondage forever. They would be released at the year of Jubilee, and you will hear Christian apologists from so many different sources arguing this way.
Well, is that true? I think you mentioned that it's only the Israelites who got the indentured servitude and got money. What about non-Israelites?
Yeah. Well, definitely across the board, I would say that the conditions of servitude, slavery in the Old Testament was better, certainly better than what slaves in the Roman Empire or slaves in the antebellum American South endured. They definitely had rights assigned to them and things. But as you say, regarding the indentured servitude gambit, that was only true with Israelites. They were, in effect, indentured servants, but it certainly didn't apply to the Gentile servants that they would buy from nations. So it didn't apply to slaves that they purchased from the nations around them. Those slaves would be slaves for life. And for them as well, the conditions were definitely better than it would be under Roman slavery or American slavery, but it was not just indentured servitude. That's not actually correct.
Although I suppose taking Gentiles as slaves would be better than, say, executing them.
Well, what the passage talks about is buying slaves from the nations around them. They were not given leeway to go make war in order to capture people and force them into slavery. The Gentile slaves, if they got them, it would only be by buying them from Gentile nations who had enslaved them. So, what do you think? Is that the satisfactory kind of answer given by the apologists?
I guess for the Israelites, but there's the problem of the Gentiles.
Yes. I find that approach, that type of argument, to be actually quite troubling. I'm reminded of this legal case where a fellow lost a leg in an accident, and he was suing, obviously, for negligence, whoever it was that was running the workplace, or wherever he lost his leg. And the defense lawyer for the company was giving this presentation to the jury about how, with modern technology, what could be done, how you could have like a prosthetic leg and it has all these capabilities now. You can walk, you can dance, you can do all kinds of things. The jury seemed to be being somewhat swayed by this argument that the damages don't need to be that high because he hasn't really lost all that much functionality. Then the fellow's lawyer did an absolute brilliant thing. He said very little. Just walked up to the jury box. He took out a prosthetic leg and he put it on the railing in front of them and said, "Now, would you rather have one of these or your actual leg?" And with that, I mean, the defense case just collapsed. The guy won his big bucks. And for these apologists who are talking about, conditions really weren't all that bad, I'd ask them, would you want to be in that condition? I don't think any of them would. I almost find that that kind of defense, it's true, it wasn't as bad, it's still not something that you would want to be in yourself. And I also find disturbing a bit this herd mentality amongst apologists, that some guy comes up with this argument and the other apologists just follow saying the same thing. I don't know if they've really even thought it through.
I mean, I guess there's always the argument that we can't reject the Bible because we don't like what it says, but is there a better argument that you can make that the Bible does not, in fact, endorse slavery?
Yes, but let me just address what you said. That's true. That's the ethical approach that's called divine command theory. Whatever God says is right is right. So if God says unpleasant things, too bad for us. That's God's prerogative to do so. And so this kind of thing isn't even an argument against God or against the Bible. To say, well, the Bible has things in it we don't like, doesn't prove it's not true. It just proves that the Bible has different views than you do. But we'll come back to that. Right now, can we do better? I think we can. And we'll do that. To do that, we'll start by summarizing this argument against the Bible in the form of logical syllogisms. Logical syllogisms is a form of arranging arguments in the way that a major premise is stated, giving a general truth, and then a minor premise, which is giving one example under that general truth, and then the conclusion drawn from it, which inevitably follows from the premises. So the argument here in the form of syllogisms would go like this. Number one, it is immoral to endorse an immoral thing. It's the major premise. The minor would be slavery is an immoral thing. Therefore, it is immoral to endorse slavery. Now, I'm going to ask, is this logically valid? And logically valid simply means, does the conclusion follow from the premises without violating the premises? So is this logically valid?
Yes.
Yes. Second syllogism. It is immoral to endorse slavery. The Bible endorses slavery. Therefore, the Bible is, at least in part, immoral. Is that logically valid?
Yeah.
Okay. So to ease the argument, we'll combine those two syllogisms into one. It is immoral to endorse an immoral thing. Slavery is an immoral thing. The Bible endorses slavery. Therefore, the Bible is, at least in part, immoral. So is this an accurate summation of the charge brought against the Bible by Sam Harris?
Yes.
Yeah. And by the YouTuber, Non-Alchemist. There's a pretty accurate summation of their arguments.
Yes.
All right. So This such is definitely logically valid. The conclusion falls from the premises. But is it logically sound? And logically sound means that it's not enough to be logically valid. Are the premises, in fact, true? If we said, for example, all lions are green, Leo is a lion, therefore Leo is green, is that logically valid?
Yes.
Yes, but people would say, yes, but all lions aren't green. Lions aren't green. So it may be logically valid, but it's not a sound argument because the premise is wrong. If I said all lions are green, Donald Duck is a lion, therefore Donald Duck is green, is that logically valid?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not sound because A, all lions aren't green, and B, Donald Duck isn't a lion. So it may be logically valid, but it's useless. It's meaningless because the premises themselves are incorrect. So if we look at the syllogism again, it is immoral to endorse an immoral thing. That's a premise, and that's true. It's axiomatic. It's almost in the definition of the terms. It is immoral to endorse an immoral thing. Then we look at the next one. Slavery is an immoral thing. The Bible endorses slavery. For the charge against the Bible, or against Christianity that is being made by Harris and non-alchemists and so many other critics, for the charge to succeed, these two premises must be true. A, slavery is an immoral thing. B, the Bible endorses slavery. So let's start with the first one. Slavery is immoral. Slavery is wrong. Now, I would certainly agree with that. But that's because I'm a Christian and I base my worldview on what the Bible says. I base my understanding of ethics, of what's right and wrong, based on what the Bible teaches.
Well, is that sort of circular since the question is whether the Bible endorses slavery or not?
Yes, I'm not proving that at this point. I'm just telling you that this is why I stand against it. For the critic, for the skeptic who doesn't accept the Bible, who doesn't accept theism in general, okay? You're the non-Christian skeptic, you're the atheist, bringing this charge against the Bible. The premise is slavery is an immoral thing, and my challenge to you is prove slavery is wrong. Can you try? Can you prove slavery is wrong?
I think most likely they will have to go on emotions because they don't have a standard, an objective standard.
Yeah, it's actually interesting watching them when you issue this challenge to them because what can they say?
I think, in my experience, what might happen is that they will accuse you of being evil because if God didn't tell you not to do slavery, then you would do it.
Yeah.
Again, without having a standard of what's evil.
Yeah. Well, you can watch them actually get more and more upset as they try to, and they realize they can't do it. It absolutely cannot be done on any basis of, say, reason, natural law, whatever. Case in point, Abraham Lincoln made a famous attempt to show from natural law, from reason, that slavery is wrong. Lincoln said, I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel.
So it's his subjective thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, think and feel. Well, that's not really a reason because obviously other people thought and felt differently. But Lincoln then made an attempt to prove that slavery was wrong, and there are so-called natural law theorists who bring up Lincoln's attempt as the greatest example of natural law reasoning. And by natural law, they mean there are certain things that people just know and understand ethically. Something that everybody knows is right, everybody knows is wrong.
Why do you think that is? If for people who are atheists who personally feel that this and that is wrong, why do they feel that way?
Well, the reality is people are not born and then live in a vacuum. Babies are born and they grow, and as they grow, they absorb things, and they absorb things from the society around them. And most people internalize values because that's what's been around them. They don't question them. They don't look for a logical basis for it. They don't look for an objective basis for it. It's just what they've come to internalize. And this is why people do that without thinking, and this is why they're almost surprised when you ask them to prove it. And to them, it's so axiomatic, there's no problem to prove it. And then when they try, they can't. And that frustrates them. These atheists, if they'd been born in, say 17 or 1800 United States South, they probably would no, I think and feel slavery is right. And they would get upset if you argued with them on that.
But then why does someone like Abraham Lincoln not feel that way?
Well, we'll get to why I think he felt that way later when we get to the issue of does the Bible actually endorse slavery or not. But at this point, let's look at his argument. He tried to argue things like, well, why do you enslave somebody? Well, if you enslave him because, say, of the color of his skin, it's darker than yours, well, then the first guy comes along with lighter skin than yours can enslave you. If you enslave people because they're not as bright as you, then the first guy comes along who's brighter than you can enslave you. And this is the way he argued. And as I said, there are philosophers who put this out as the ne plus ultra example of rational reasoning for ethical conclusions. But it absolutely doesn't work. Well, all that really is an appeal to self-interest, saying, well, you shouldn't have slavery because then other people might enslave you. And the problem with that, though, is if I say, well, okay, I'm going to be against slavery because I don't want other people to enslave me, when somebody stronger than I comes along, and I say, well, you shouldn't enslave me because I didn't enslave others, he's going to laugh in my face and say, hey, he should have done it. The strong always enslave the weak, or the stronger enslave the weaker. The fact that you chose not to do that, I think that's a dumb choice, and I'm still going to enslave you. At the end of the day, there is no way to prove that slavery is wrong on the basis of anything other than you can get God to say it's wrong. And this is why this other YouTube atheist, The Sound of Science, he's got this little video. It's quite interesting to watch called Atheist versus Theist, How to Fail at Debating Slavery in the Bible. The Sound of Science fella, he's trying to prove slavery is wrong. And he's reduced finally to this is his arguments. Dude, this is the 21st century. Slavery is wrong. It's that easy. Just say it.
Oh, so it's based on what century it is?
Yeah, that's a logical fallacy known as appeal to novelty. But yeah, that's is that logically valid? Does that?
I don't even. He doesn't even have a premise.
Well, his premise is it's the 21st century. Therefore, slavery is wrong.
No, it's not. That's not logically valid or logically sound.
But that's all he's got. And later, when he sees he can't prove it, he thinks, oh, we're going to make the theist look so stupid about slavery. But as it goes on, he just cannot give a case to prove it's wrong. And then he ends up saying, demanding, just say slavery is wrong. And if you don't, you're a complete son of a expletive deleted.
Yeah, that's where they go. When they can't defend it logically, they start going ad hominem.
Yeah. So, which is another logical fallacy. So, again, I repeat, slavery is wrong. And I say that based on my understanding as a Christian. But without that, the skeptics who bring up the charge against Christianity, saying, well, it endorses slavery and slavery is evil, they're the ones who have to actually give some reason to demonstrate that it's evil. Okay? Just saying, hey, it's the 21st century, slavery is wrong. He's just saying it. Is he proving it? All he can do is bald assertions and appeals to insults. And at that point, he's lost the argument. When he says, dude, this is the 21st century, slavery is wrong, then would we conclude that it was not wrong and say the 17th century?
Well, I suppose it doesn't matter to him since he doesn't live in the 17th century.
But if whether it's right or wrong depends on what time period you're in, does that mean morality changes? Was it wrong today but right before? If it was right before, why was it right? If it's wrong now, why was it wrong? How does time changing make something right or wrong, or change whether it's right or wrong? Is it determined by majority opinion? Because in the 21st century, most people are against it. Would that mean it was right in the 17th century when most people were for it? This opens up this entire issue that if we look through history, every society in the history of the world had slavery and thought it was right to do so.
So the problem is that every society in history had slavery, practiced slavery, and nobody thought there was anything wrong with it.
That must be why he says 21st century.
Well, he could have probably gone to the 20th century and into the 19th century as well. But even then, it was just the Western world. Most of the world thought slavery has always been right, and there's some countries in the world that practice it to this day. The ancient Greek city-states, they had slavery. Roman Empire had slavery. The Muslim empires were major players. And there was enslaving all kinds of people. They enslaved a lot of Caucasians. The word slave, actually, the English word slave comes from Slav, the Slavic peoples, because so many of them were captured and sold into slavery. All over Africa, slavery was practiced long before any Europeans got there. It was practiced on a large scale. Tribes made war on one another for the purpose of capturing slaves. Point of fact, The Woman King was a movie released in 2022. It was supposed to be an American historical action film that was about the Agoji, which was supposed to be an all-female war unit from an African kingdom called Dahomey, 17th to 19th century. This particular movie takes place in the 1820s, and it focuses on one of the leaders of the Agoji, training the next generation of warriors to fight their enemies. The description in Wikipedia says, later on in the Wikipedia description, it says, the film received generally positive reviews from critics, with praise directed toward Viola Davis' performance in the action choreography, though it received criticism for historical distortion of slavery. Well, that's an actually interesting way of putting it. Historical distortion of slavery. That is an understatement. The historical reality was the Dahomey nation were major players in the transatlantic slave trade. And not only that, they kept slaves themselves, and they made war on other tribes to capture the people for slavery. And the movie has them fighting against the slave trade, fighting against the evil Europeans who are coming to get slaves, and the Dahomey are fighting for freedom. The historical reality is that it was French forces coming in, trying to force the Dahomey to give up slave trading. That's what they were fighting. They were fighting to keep slavery. So you see, here's the problem. Here's the problem that it's being practiced historically all over the place. So when atheists use this attack on Christianity, this challenge, to say that, well, the Bible endorses slavery and slavery is wrong, they cannot get to base one proving that slavery is wrong. And why should their very minority opinion, based on nothing, well, just say it's wrong, I feel it's wrong, I think it's wrong, how does that stand against the overwhelming majority opinion through history of people who felt and thought it was right?
I suppose maybe they'll say they did it doesn't mean they felt and thought it was right. Maybe they felt and thought it was wrong, but they decided to do it anyway.
Well, that's some very interesting speculation, but how would you prove it?
Well, you can't.
And if they did it even though they thought it was wrong, which I don't think, but even if they did that, that still wouldn't prove it was wrong. The interesting thing, this particularly interesting, go through history, even slaves didn't think the institution or practice of slavery was wrong. They didn't like being slaves, but they didn't think it was wrong. We have records both from the Roman Empire and the American antebellum, before the Civil War, antebellum South, that slaves who, in one way or another, became freedmen, but slaves themselves. A historian named Halliburton showed that free black people have owned slaves in each of the 13 original states and later in every state that allowed slavery. And that's going back to 1654. There's a time that free black people could own the services of white indentured servants in Virginia. Free blacks owned slaves in Boston by 1724, in Connecticut by 1783. By 1790, 48 black people in Maryland owned 143 slaves. One Maryland farmer, black fellow named Nat Butler, purchased and sold blacks for the Southern trade. This is all in this essay by this historian named Halliburton. So here's the thing. Everybody thought it's right. Now today, for some reason, the Western world, but pretty much only the Western world, thinks it's wrong. How then can you prove it? How can you say the Bible is wrong just because you think it's wrong? Harris, Sound of Science, non-alchemists, all they can do is say, it's wrong. Say it's wrong. They can't prove it. They can't give objective reasons. All they can do is these assertions and insults. So there you go. That's the problem. On their syllogism, the first point, the first premise that slavery is wrong, slavery is immoral, they already can't prove that one. But we don't want to stop here, obviously, because the rest of it is even more interesting. The question is why? Why do people today think not just that slavery is wrong, but it's axiomatically wrong? It's just obviously wrong.
Maybe it's only people in the developed countries who think so, though, because as you said, there's still slavery going on.
It's axiomatic, but only in certain places, and that's exactly the point we're looking at. What caused the shift in attitude? To answer that, we have to ask, where did it happen? And where it happened was in the Christian world, or Christendom. It happened in the Christian world, and it happened only in the Christian world. It's only the Christian world that ever decided slavery was wrong and took steps to end it. And
in that case, though, why did it take so long until the Civil War? Weren't those places Christian nations long before then?
Well, this is why I said Christendom. Christian nation means that it's founded upon Christian principles. You have a lot of Christians there, but you also had a lot of non-Christians there. So Christendom didn't always do the right thing. But don't assume that slavery didn't end until the American Civil War, which ended in 1865. Other parts of the Christian world ended it long before that. For example, Toronto, it was called York, capital of Upper Canada. The instant it became self-governing under Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe in 1796, the first thing he did was outlaw slavery. That's before the American Civil War. The Brits started it in the very early 19th century. It was happening across the Christian world before it got to America. And there were abolitionists in America before the Civil War. That didn't happen overnight. It led up to, there was this long period of division and schism between predominantly northern states where the people said we shouldn't have slavery and the southern states where they said we should have it. So, yeah, it took time to overturn these. William Wilberforce, a well-known abolitionist activist who was the key player in Britain overturning the slave trade, he was at it for, I think, 50 years before he finally saw success, but he did. So they were turning against it, but the key question is why there and why only there? Why only in the society that read and studied the Bible and tried to base their morality on what they learned from the Bible? If the Bible endorses slavery, and if it clearly endorses slavery, as the critics claim, how did the Christian world studying the Bible come to the conclusion that slavery was wrong? And they didn't just end it. Britain, for example, they ended it, and then they used their Royal Navy to try to stop the slave trade of other countries all over the world. So isn't that noteworthy? Christian society decided from the Bible that slavery was wrong. And ironically, it's only because of the Christian heritage of the Western world, admittedly is fading, but it's still there. That's the only reason that people like Harris and non-alchemists and Sound of Science and all of these critics actually think slavery is wrong and even think it's axiomatic. Because it's Christianity that told them it's wrong, though they don't realize that that's where it came from. And then ironically, they use that to attack Christianity. So again, we have to ask if all of the abolition movements, all of the movements to end slavery were spearheaded by Christians, and that's where it happened and nobody else, why was that the case if the Bible endorses slavery? Well, one obvious answer to that is that the Bible does not, in fact, endorse slavery.
Well, even our critic didn't say that the New Testament endorses it, although he did say that it doesn't clearly speak against it. But what about the Old Testament, or does that matter since we're not under the Old Testament law?
I don't think the Old Testament endorsed it really either. And we're going to look at exactly what the Bible does say and why these critics are wrong. Harris said that, in his little blurb, he said that the Old Testament explicitly endorses it and the New Testament doesn't repudiate it. But based on those passages we've seen before, other critics will claim that, yes, the New Testament also endorses it. But when we consider the fact that only Christian societies ended slavery and they based that on what the Bible says, we need to take a closer look, actually, at this claim that the Bible endorses slavery and at what the Bible actually does teach.
So then what about what we saw in the Old Testament?
Okay. Here is where we have to be very specific in meaning and in terms. The Old Testament definitely has some regulations governing slavery. But does the fact that it has regulations governing slavery mean that it endorses it? Okay? Endorse means to express approval of something or to give support to it, especially by public statements. Would regulations governing slavery be tantamount to endorsing it?
Well, I think people today would not say that, because even in our modern day, sometimes governments talk about regulating certain behaviors to reduce harm caused to those people, but they haven't actually outlawed.
Can you give us some examples?
Oh, I think some years ago there was a big case talking about prostitution and arguing about whether it should be legal or not, and or whether there should be rules to regulate it if it's legal. I think I've heard the same kind of thing about controlled substances for some drugs. Instead of outlawing the drug, they would talk about safer ways for the people to get the drug, so not as much harm is done.
Yeah, those are good examples, because people could say that, you know what, it's wrong and bad to do drugs, but we want to pass laws to regulate it so at least we can limit the harm. Even though we don't think it's a good thing to be done, it's going to be done, and so we want to limit the harm. And that, in fact, is what you do in the Old Testament law. There are Christians who think that the Old Testament law was the expression of God's perfect will. And so everything that it allows must be right. And if it regulates slavery, it must be endorsing it. But that, in fact, is a misunderstanding of the law. And we can show that quite clearly from Jesus' own words. Could you read this passage for us, please? Mark chapter 10, verses 2 to 9.
The Pharisees came and asked him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" testing him. And he answered and said to them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her." And Jesus answered and said to them, "Because of the hardness of your heart he wrote you this precept. But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate."
All right, this is a crucial point to understand. The Old Testament law had regulations for how to divorce your wife. When Jesus was asked about it, he said, no, you should not divorce. Divorce is wrong. Even in the Old Testament, in Malachi, it says that God hates divorce. But it's in there. And why is it in there? Well, Jesus gives you the answer right. He says, because of the hardness of your heart, he wrote you this precept. What would that mean?
Because their hearts are so hard, they're going to do those bad things anyway. So by putting on a regulation, even if their heart is too hard to abstain from doing it altogether, maybe they'll at least follow the rules governing the behavior.
Yeah, exactly. The law was put in not because divorce is being endorsed, but because God, knowing the hardness of the people's hearts, put in a law that would give some level of protection to the wife who was divorced. He could have just said, yeah, no divorce in any circumstances, and then they would have done it anyway, and the woman would have been left without any protection at all.
Although I have to wonder, if they're going to disobey God anyway in terms of the divorce, why would they not disobey in terms of the protections to the wife also?
Well, you can't guarantee that they won't, and probably sometimes they did disobey, like everything else in the law. But the thing is, what do they really want? They want to get rid of their wives. And if the law says, well, yeah, you can get rid of her, but this is the way you do it, they're much more likely to follow that and feel that they're okay now.
And even so, the law didn't say, yeah, you can get rid of her. It just states regulations about if you get rid of her, right?
Yeah. So it does stand to reason that as long as they get what they really want, they'd be willing to follow the guidelines around it. There's a saying that says, don't let the great become the enemy of the good. And what that means is that, you want to go for the absolute best thing, completely ban divorce, but in the end, it doesn't do any good. Okay? It would be better, at least God thought it was better, and God's always right, to regulate it, even though it's a wrong thing. And that's flat out clear here about divorce. But once you see that there's at least one thing in the Bible that God regulated to afford some level of protection to the victims rather than ban it outright, because banning outright would not stop it from happening, but would leave the victims without any protections at all. Once you see it being done here, then you could see that it would be done on other things as well. And I would think slavery is definitely one of those.
But here there's, as you mentioned, there was an explicit statement that God hates divorce. If there's no explicit statement for slavery, then how would we know that the same reasoning applies?
Well, that's what we're going to do, is look at what the New Testament really says about this, and then we'll know whether it endorses it or not. But the principle that God put some things into the law that didn't represent his ideal will, to regulate them being done by evil people, to give protections to the victims, that principle is there. So the idea that some people say the Old Testament law is the perfect expression of God's will, anything in there must be what God wants. This passage, it's about divorce, but it knocks that principle into a cocked hat. The idea that, if it's in there, it's because God approved of it. There are things in there he regulates that he did not approve of. So that certainly opens the possibility that slavery is one of those. And I will say from the New Testament that I would say it's not just a possibility, it's a fact.
Okay, so then what about the New Testament?
Well, as we've already seen, there are passages that enjoin slaves to be obedient to their masters. The critics are very happy to point those out. But that's not an endorsement of slavery, certainly not directly. The passages never say, slavery is good, you should have slavery. Slavery is a legitimate practice. There's no such statement as that. There's no explicit endorsement of slavery, no direct endorsement.
Well, isn't it indirectly an endorsement? I mean, it sounds from those passages like a slave can't even try to escape because, escaping wouldn't be being obedient or submissive.
Well, that I don't agree that it prevents the possibility of escape. And we'll get to why that is. But even in the Old Testament law, that we looked at in Deuteronomy 23:15. It says, you will not return an escaped slave to his master. Well, if escaping was wrong, then that provision wouldn't be there at all. But I think what's really happening is the critics are missing the point of these passages. And they're either missing or not applying something that's fundamental to the New Testament and its ethic, which they understand it's there, and yet somehow they don't make the connection. Consider this famous passage, Luke chapter 6, 27 to 29. Could you read that out for us?
But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. To him who strikes you on the one cheek, offer the other also, and from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either.
All right, so let me ask the $64,000 question here. Jesus is telling you that if someone strikes you on one cheek, offer the other also. Submit. Does that mean that would anybody think that means that Jesus is endorsing unprovoked physical assault?
Well, on first glance, it does look as if you're supposed to just take it and not defend yourself.
Yes, but does that mean he's approving the attack? Would anybody take this passage to mean that it is right to commit violent assault on somebody? But it says, to him who strikes you on the cheek, it doesn't say, oh, that's doing something wrong, you shouldn't do it. He's telling the person to submit. Offer the other also.
Yeah, so it sounds like although it's not directly saying that it's right to or okay to assault somebody, it sounds like there's no recourse for the victim. You just have to let yourself be beaten up.
Okay, once again though, is this saying that physical assault is right?
No.
All right, so that's exactly the point here. In this passage, Jesus is talking to people who live in an evil world where people do evil things to you and telling them how to respond, how to live in a world where people do evil things. And what he says, this particular example, if somebody strikes you on one cheek, offer the other also. Nobody, I don't think anybody has ever read this passage, said, oh, well, then it must be okay to do violent assault because Jesus says, submit, give in, that means violent assault is okay. Nobody says that. And so much of the New Testament is exactly about how to live in a fallen world where people will wrong you. Matthew 5:44, do good to those who hate you and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. I mean, those are bad things. To use somebody spitefully, to persecute somebody, those are bad things. But Jesus says, do good to them. Pray for them. Nobody would look at that and say, oh, that endorses. That means it's okay to spitefully use Christians and persecute them. The more one reads, the more obvious this becomes that so much of the New Testament is teaching people how to live in a world where people will use you wrongly and do bad things to you. And the idea is you don't retaliate, you live peaceably, you suffer evil. Now, I don't think it's blanket. There are times you need to fight back, but you understand the point. Nobody looks and says, okay, turn the other cheek, that means violence also is okay. Submit to your masters. Oh, that means slavery is okay. You see the difference? They don't get the point that when passages say submit to your masters, it's exactly the same kind of passage as this, where it says to him who strikes you on one cheek, offer the other also. It's telling you how to live in a world where you are being and going to be wronged. And the more we read the New Testament, the more we see that. Let's look at the passage, for example, 1 Peter 2:18 that we saw before. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. And people say, oh, see, that's an endorsement of slavery. But let's read more of the passage. Now let's go on to verse 20. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully.
Oh, wrongfully.
Yeah, what does that mean?
That means that slavery is wrong. Although I suppose someone might say only harsh slavery.
Well, it includes both, though. The good and gentle and the harsh. So here, when you read the rest of the passage, which apparently our critics and skeptics haven't done, it's making it clear that this is just like turning the other cheek. You're living in a world that has evil, in this case slavery, and yeah, just like turning the other cheek, you should be submissive, but you are suffering wrongfully by being enslaved. Okay, you're being submissive, conscience toward God, who says, well, yeah, that's what Christians do in an evil world. But as you keep reading to verse 20, it becomes clear that the person who's enslaved is suffering wrongfully. So this is not an endorsement of slavery, quite the opposite. Then we have this one. Another point about it, Ephesians 6, 5-7, we saw that slaves be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers. But again, let's continue the passage. Not with eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service to the Lord and not to men. We see the same thing in Colossians 3:22-25, if we continue reading beyond what the skeptic will cite for us. Slaves, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. For you serve the Lord Christ, but he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. So what you see in these two passages is, one, these commands offer dignity to people, offer dignity to the slaves, because they can feel and understand that what they're doing by submitting to being used wrongfully is going to be honored by God and is going to give them a reward. They can feel there's an ultimate purpose to what they're doing, and there will be a reward, and he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. The day will come where there will be justice, and the slaveholder will get his. Now people might say, okay, how do you know that refers to the slaveholder? Well, let's look back again at Ephesians 6, 5-7, and continue now to verse 9. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service, as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. And you, masters, do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. Listen, no partiality, that's the warning to the slave masters.
Yeah, but the warning is only not threatening the slaves, but not the warning doesn't seem to cover having slaves at all.
Well, okay, that's one example, giving up threatening. But the point is, when he says there's no partiality with him, that's because the masters think we're better than the slaves, we're above them, we're more valuable, so we can do things to them, and that's okay. And he's pointing out there's no partiality with him. That he's going to judge both. He's going to judge the master and the slave. And as we saw in Colossians 3:25, he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there's no partiality. That's a warning to masters, and he has done wrong. And we saw that in 1 Peter, chapter 2, 18-20, that just by virtue of being a slave, you are suffering wrongfully. It is wrong, and there's no partiality with God. And so the slave owners will someday give account. They will be repaid for what they have done. So it's interesting when you start looking carefully at the text and thinking about what it says, you start getting a very different picture from what the critics would have you believe is being taught. Critics complain that the New Testament tells slaves to serve their Christian masters. You heard that one from Harris, Sam Harris, in 1 Timothy 6:2, and those who have believing masters, let them not despise them. Despise, by the way, it doesn't mean like hate or have bad feelings towards. Despise means disrespect. Treat with contempt. Let them not despise them because they are brethren, but rather serve them because those who are benefited are believers and beloved. So there you go. If your master's a Christian, serve him properly because he's a fellow Christian benefiting from your work. But is that plan A? Is that really what God wants Christians, to have Christians as slaves, to have slaves at all? Here we come to the matter of an escaped slave. And that whole little letter of Paul, Philemon, is all about that, where there's this slave, Onesimus, who fled from his master, Philemon. Philemon was a Christian, and apparently he was converted through the ministry of Paul. And Onesimus comes across Paul, and he comes to Christ. And now Paul is going to send Onesimus back to Philemon, and it's a plea for Onesimus to treat him properly. And notice what Paul says to Onesimus here. Therefore, though I might be very bold in Christ to command you what is fitting, yet for love's sake I rather appeal to you, being such a one as Paul the aged, and now also a prisoner of Jesus Christ. I appeal to you for my son Onesimus, whom I have begotten while in my chains, who once was unprofitable to you, but now is profitable to you and to me. I am sending him back. You therefore receive him, that is my own heart, whom I wish to keep with me, that on your behalf he might minister to me in my chains for the gospel. Paul's under arrest at this point. But without your consent I wanted to do nothing, that your good deed might not be by compulsion, as it were, but voluntary. For perhaps he departed for a while for this purpose, that you might receive him forever, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. So we see an awful lot here. Paul is quite clear. He says, I might be very bold in Christ to command you what is fitting. And as you read through, you see that what is fitting is manumission. It's for Onesimus to set, for Philemon to set Onesimus free. That's what is fitting. And Paul says, I could command you to do it, but I'd rather have you do it from your own heart, voluntarily, not by compulsion, out of love. Okay? And this is why perhaps he didn't command Christian masters to free their Christian slaves. But there's understanding that is what is fitting. They should do that. He wants them to do that not because they're commanded to, but because they understand that that's the right thing. That's what's fitting. And that's how it eventually happened. Christians didn't manumit their slaves because they were commanded to. They manumitted them because they came to the conclusion that slavery was wrong. Now there's more. Okay, there's more. There's, of course, the golden rule in Christianity. Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets, Matthew 7:12. That's Jesus speaking. How does a Christian read this and then think, okay, I have slaves. Okay, would I want men to do that to me? No, I would want them to free me. John 13:34, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, as I've loved you, that you also love one another. So particularly with Christian slaves, no question. You cannot in good conscience read these and not eventually come to the conclusion that, yeah, you know what? Slavery is wrong. It is a violation of the golden rule. It is a violation of the law. And this, at the end of the day, is why slavery became absolutely unacceptable to Christians, why they turned against it, and why only Christian societies ever did. Atheists have a whole different set of golden rules. What do you think, Saya?
Probably atheist rules would be, if you did this to me, I'm going to do this back to you, and worse than what you did to me.
Yeah, they have all kinds of golden rules. He who has the gold makes the rules. Survival of the fittest. Do unto others before others do unto you. They have no objective morality for their behaviors. This is why, at the end of the day, they cannot and never did say slavery was wrong.
And one more thing about this, Sonia. Consider 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 8 to 11. Could you read that for us, please?
But we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for the lawless and insubordinate, for the ungodly and for sinners, for the unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers.
Yeah, murderers of mothers, for manslayers. This is one of these passages where a whole bunch of sins, serious sins, are listed. Within it, there's this interesting word which is translated in the New King James as kidnappers. And the Greek word is andrapadistes. What does andrapadistes mean? If you look up in the standard, industry standard Greek lexicon, the BDAG, Bauer, Donker, Arndt, Gingrich, under andrapadistes, it says, one taken in war and sold as a slave is where it comes from. Originally, the meaning is one who acquires persons for use by others. And the glosses for that, the words you can use in English, slave dealer or kidnapper. Notice, slave dealer. So it's obscured a bit, putting in the word kidnapper. I'm not sure why they put kidnapper there. The original King James Version translates it just as men stealers, which is actually more accurate, because it really is any form of stealing a person, any form of taking somebody, taking ownership of somebody for use by others. So in this list of serious sins, one of them, listed along with things like murder and fornication, is slave dealers. It's for slave dealers. Now, there are people who say that the Bible, the New Testament, never explicitly forbids slave dealers. I would think this is a pretty clear, assuming people know what the Greek word means, this would be a pretty clear condemnation, wouldn't you say so?
Yes.
Yeah, it's almost undeniable. Now, there are skeptics and critics who try to deny it. I came across one guy on YouTube who was trying to argue that this word doesn't mean slave dealers, it means kidnappers, and only kidnappers. But that's actually not true. All of it comes from the idea of slaves. If you look in the Septuagint, the ancient translation of the Old Testament into Greek, you find the word there for slave is andrapadiston. So it all revolves around the idea of slavery, but it refers to any kind of taking of people in order to press them into service. So certainly it includes kidnappers, but it's definitely not limited to it. So when this would be read in the original language by the original readers and they come across andrapadistes, they would understand this is slave dealer. So the attempts to get around that and say it's only restricted to kidnapper really does not fly. It's actual nonsense. So let's sum up the whole thing. Let's sum up what we've seen. The charge brought by critics against the Bible is that the Bible endorses slavery, and that's immoral. It's immoral to endorse an immoral practice. Slavery is an immoral practice. The Bible endorses slavery, therefore the Bible is immoral, at least in part. We pointed out the fact that for this argument to be sound, not just logically correct, logically it is correct, but to be sound, the premises must be true. So the skeptic first has to demonstrate, prove objectively that slavery is an immoral practice. Now, a Christian can say it is immoral based on the Word of God, as we've seen through careful analysis. Slavery is immoral. But the critics can't. They bring this charge against the Bible, and then they can't back it up because, apart from the Bible, they have no objective standard for saying that slavery is immoral. The best they can do is babble things like, dude, this is the 21st century, slavery is wrong, it's that easy, just say it. Just say slavery is wrong, and if you don't, you're a complete son of an expletive deleted. They have trouble because this was practiced by every society throughout history. Nobody thought it was wrong. Not even the slaves thought it was wrong, though they didn't like it. So they can't back up the first premise. They can't back up the other one either. The Bible endorses slavery. That comes from a very careless, very superficial reading putting in a bunch of assumptions, a failure to study in detail the text, all of the relevant text, a failure to understand what endorse even means. The historical fact is that Christians studying the Bible were the ones and the only ones who realized that slavery is indeed wrong, and they realized that from the Bible, and they became the only people ever to end slavery, to ban it, and to force others to stop it. So we'd have to ask our critics, how did that happen? If the Bible actually endorses slavery, why would Christians read the Bible and come to the conclusion that slavery is wrong? The truth is, it stands against slavery. Okay? We Christians, we can say that slavery is wrong, and we can say it with good reason. The critics, cannot. They cannot say slavery is wrong. Or they can say it, but they can't back it up. We can. So it's really not necessary for Christians to do silly things like trying to defend against this charge by arguing that slavery in those days really wasn't so bad. That's just silly. We don't need to do that. We need to go into the text and show, as we've done, that the Bible is against slavery. Charge dismissed.
Thank you, John. Another example of why you can't just cherry pick verses and you have to look at the whole context and the whole Bible.
Indeed it is. And when you do that, the Bible always comes out smelling like roses.
Thanks, John. We'll see you next time for another important topic.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.